This is the first podcast about Chapter 14, Observation Tools and Techniques, or Assessing Effective Teaching in Physical Education. Most everyone in education has identified teacher observation as an essential skill for collecting information on the teaching and learning process. In this context, observation is being done to assess the teaching process and the performance of the teacher. Teachers should be knowledgeable about how to use observation to collect valid and reliable information about their teaching. This chapter is going to help us look at alternative methods and techniques for the observation and analysis of instruction. Instead of just a principal coming in and using a checklist, we have several other ways that we can evaluate teaching in physical education. We're also going to describe several tools commonly used to collect information on the basic instructional skills of the teacher. There's several different points we need to discuss about collecting information on teaching. First of all, most of the observation tools in this chapter are talking about tools that can be used for self-evaluation or reflection to improve teaching. We need to look at the process as well as the product of teaching. Many times these observation tools and the data collected from them can be used by a teacher to put in their teaching portfolio, and it can also be used for student data. The present system of evaluation pretty much means that a principal comes in to observe a physical education teacher, many times not knowing what is important in teaching physical education. They know more about their particular subject area instead of ours. And usually they use a general tool that has to do with good teaching practices across all content areas. However, we'd like to collect data on our teaching specifically in physical education. Many times a teacher's perceptions about their own teaching is very inaccurate. So we need to look at direct observation, which is accurate. And what we usually do is have the observer collect data on some aspect of the teacher's teaching, and then present that data to the teacher and let the teacher make the judgments or make the inferences from the data. Some current problems we have with teacher evaluation and observation is that checklists that principals use are very subjective, and usually they're not very reliable or valid. One of the reasons why we're doing the teacher performance assessment in this class is because the teacher performance assessment has been made reliable and valid by the University of Stanford or Stanford University out in California. They have come up with a reliable and valid tool for looking at teacher effectiveness. Sometimes we're reviewed by our peers, in other words, colleagues that are teachers, but peers are, and particularly principals that are not in our subject area, are not trained to observe physical education. Usually the purpose of teacher observation is evaluation, not improvement. Teachers are anxious about observations because they usually mean a summative purpose to it. That is, either they're going to get tenure or not, or they're going to keep their job or not. So no wonder teachers are very anxious about observations. But if we turned it around to make it so that you're actually looking at something that's meaningful in physical education, they may not be as anxious. Most of us in education now realize that systematic observation is the best way to evaluate teaching effectiveness in any classroom. Systematic observation is the process of collecting objective data and using it and analyzing it for meaning for the teachers. The responsibility of the profession in teaching is to monitor itself and to make sure that teachers are effective in their teaching. Students are not appropriate judges for whether a teacher is a good teacher or not, particularly because they're biased according to what grades they're getting and whether they think the teacher likes them or not. Effective teacher can be defined and measured. It does require a cultural change in the schools because systematic observation is a way to collect data, give it back to the teacher, and let them realize what it is that they need to work on. The process of systematic observation is that data is collected by a live observer, usually using a systematic observation tool. It looks at what actually happens in the class. It provides objective information for the teacher to look at, and then the teacher can make the judgments about his or her own teaching. Using systematic observation to evaluate teachers is also known as clinical supervision. The primary goal is the improvement of teaching, not trying to get rid of teachers and not trying to make sure that teachers get tenure or whatever other summative reason there might be. It is a very interactive process, and it's a teacher-centered process. There are mutual interpretations between the observer and the teacher. The steps are, there's three basic steps to clinical supervision. The observer goes in and has a pre-conference with the teacher to find out what their lesson plan is for that day and what they need to focus on. And usually that is done before the day, several days before the lesson is actually taught. Then there's the in-class observation, where the observer goes in and uses a systematic observation tool to look at some aspect of what the teacher wants to look at in their teaching. In other words, whether students are talking while they're trying to talk and they're not noticing, or whether they're moving around the classroom and getting to all of the students in the class, whether they're giving specific feedback that's corrective and congruent. All of those things have tools or systematic observation tools that we can use for that. And then after the observation occurs, it doesn't have to be the same day, but it could, we have a post-conference where we actually take the data and give it back to the teacher and let them see what happened in the class and let them make their own conclusions or evaluations of what they did. This is the best way to help teachers improve in their teaching effectiveness. Choosing the observation tool is sometimes difficult, but it depends on the data the teacher is looking for, what they'd like to look at in their teaching, and the practicality of the tool in the situation. Observation tools should provide information on a specific concern in teaching, and usually that concern is expressed by the teacher, not the person who is observing. Observation tools should be practical in nature, in other words, not so difficult that an observer has to look at multiple things at one time. It should also provide objectivity, in other words, no value judgments made on what the data is showing. Teachers can be very defensive about observations, so it's important to try to use these observational tools and make sure it's a formative assessment instead of a summative assessment. On this slide and the other podcasts, we're going to talk about different ways of using observation and different tools to use for observing teachers to see about their teaching effectiveness. Intuitive observation is one that is actually used right now quite a lot with principals as they come in to evaluate teachers. It's not a systematic procedure. The observer goes into the setting totally open and draws conclusions about the teacher's effectiveness just from an overall observational view. The problem is that there's a high probability of invalid and unreliable data. The more experienced the observer, the better the data. You can isolate and identify glaring problems in teaching just by going to observe, not writing anything down, and coming up with a report after the observation is over with to show what needs to be done. But this is a very unreliable and invalid way to do teacher effectiveness evaluation. This is the end of podcast 1 on Chapter 14, Observation Tools and Techniques.